I went to Vietnam a couple of times. I spent as a door gunner, volunteered as quite a number of airfield defence guards had to become door gunners.
They called it a 5-minute life. Strapped to a bungee-hung M60 on the edge of a Huey.
Both did the same thing. We protected the helicopter on its flanks with an M60 and our other weapons that we had.
The door gunner faced walls of tracers with little more than nerve and a fabric harness. Their courage was more than exposure. It was built into a system that used their lives as a shield. But why did so many die, even after heavier guns and better tactics arrived? In this video, we uncover the dark truth behind their losses through unit logs, veteran accounts, and battle records, and how this role's sacrifice helped force the birth of the attack helicopter. High, fast, and wrong. When the United States committed helicopters to Vietnam, commanders carried a dangerous assumption. Machines could survive the battlefield if they simply flew higher and faster than the enemy could aim. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois, quickly nicknamed the Huey, was seen as a flying pickup truck with turbine engines. Its job was straightforward: haul soldiers, rations, and ammunition across rivers, jungles, and rice paddies, then return for more. The early playbook stressed mobility above all else. If the aircraft avoided hovering, enemy rifles and machine guns would struggle to track a moving target. But the reality of combat shattered that neat theory almost immediately. The first problem came with landing zones. Infantry could not leap from 1,000 feet. They needed a controlled insertion. Hueys had to descend into small clearings, flare, and hover, while troops jumped or cargo was pushed out. That pause, often lasting 30 seconds or more, was all the opportunity North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters required. The second problem came with casualties. Medevac helicopters became lifelines, swooping into the jungle to pull out the wounded. Yet every pickup required the aircraft to slow hover and sometimes touch down on terrain barely wider than the rotor disc. In those moments, the Huey was practically stationary. With ruthless speed, the enemy forces adapted. Small arms fire was everywhere in the skies. The arc from the AK-47 was upward, only to be further joined along the Ho Chi Minh Trail by heavier stuff like RPD machine guns, DSHK heavy machine guns, and finally radar-guided 37mm cannons. Initially, crews were convinced that altitude was a guarantee in their favor, but the jungle canopy ruled that possibility out. Flying too high meant missing landing zones or overshooting tree lines. It had to be a low flight, with low meaning exposure. The Viet Cong did not really need radar locks or heat-seeking missiles. They only had to await the moment when the helicopters slowed over the green clearings, then shoot where the rotor wash bent the grass. The loss figures stole past at an incredibly high speed. Of the nearly 12,000 helicopters deployed to Southeast Asia during the war, more than 5,600 were the best part of half. The Huey carried most of it, almost 2,700 destroyed in less than a decade. Such figures weren't mere accidents of statistics. The numbers describe the tragic mismatch between doctrine and reality. No transport aircraft should ever pull such a role. Helicopters flew straight into fire over and over again with minimal armor. Speed and altitude lived only on training diagrams. In the jungle, rules collapsed. Though mechanical shortcomings contributed to the Huey's undoing, awkwardly wide for a helicopter at almost 9 feet, its broad fuselage presented an unwelcome tag on the green backdrop. It was vulnerable because essential systems, the engine, transmission, and tail rotor, were armored. A single bullet to the mast could send the Huey spiraling down. This hardly took long to learn for adversary gunners. The pilot, even if he could pull some aerobatics, simply could not stay steady in a hover. at which point all skill in the world would be of no avail. Crews often reminisced about those seconds as the longest of their lives. Survivability wasn't going to come from flying higher. It had to come from the open doors themselves. That's where a new role stepped in. Feet on the skid, finger on the trigger. Birth of the door gunner. The solution to the helicopter's vulnerability came not from blueprints or Pentagon memos, but from the field. Pilots and crew chiefs faced a brutal reality. Every time a Huey slowed down, they were helpless targets. The first improvisation was simple and almost crude. Mechanics yanked the cabin doors off, hung an M60 machine gun from a bungee cord, and told the crew chief to lean out and spray anything that moved. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Suddenly, one side of the Huey had a wall of lead. The problem, of course, was that the other side remained exposed. The fix was to bring in another man. At first, they called him a shotgun rider, a kind of unofficial fourth wheel bolted onto the crew. Soon enough, though, he had a permanent title, the door gunner. This role didn't exist in the original Huey manuals. It was born out of necessity, built on improvisation, and carried forward by volunteers who wanted a chance to fight. The Army never had a shortage of men stepping forward. Motor pool mechanics, supply clerks, and even cooks swapped wrenches, ladles, and shovels for a steel helmet and the roaring barrel of an M60. Who would want to volunteer for what appeared to be a death mission? For many, it was about adrenaline and stepping out of tedious support roles and into the fight. Some had more than an adventurous spirit. They hungered for the camaraderie of the infantry squads, sharing danger from the sky. Others were just young and restless, caught up in the allure of speed and firepower. The cockpit might have offered better odds, yet the open door offered something far different from anything ever found in the barracks: immediate gratification. Door gunners didn't just witness the battle, they were a very real part of it, belt by belt, round by round. The training was short and intensive. There was no room for fancy gadgetry and procedures of simulation, no advanced optics, and no guided systems to assist the gunner. They shot from a vibrating, banking helicopter at moving, dark silhouettes in the jungle below. Instinct and a steady hand were the only two factors that had anything to do with hit or miss. Technology had nothing to do with it. About 2,000 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition were carried in belts that were fed through the M606. For the gunners, every round was precious. They calculated how many belts they could go through as there was no resupply in midair. They became experts at shooting bursts, varying the cadence of fire from suppression to long bursts, deciding when to saturate an area and when to be short and more precise. The allowed protection was the least. The Army gave out flame-resistant jackets, but these materials were only meant to stop shrapnel, as intended by the design, and not bullets. The ceramic chest plate weighed almost 15 pounds and was heavy enough to restrict movement, meaning many gunners took them off before takeoff. They trusted agility instead of armor. Most relied on nothing more than a web harness clipped to the cabin, crouched on the skid, with boots hanging into the slipstream. Wind, noise, and rotor wash were constant companions. A sudden maneuver could fling a man out the door if his grip failed. Yet the greatest risk wasn't falling. It was catching a bullet before he could even return fire. The profession soon turned into legend. Door gunners were never simply passengers armed for assassination from above. They were the teeth of the Huey. Their fields of fire turned, hovering from death wish to possibly survivable for a few more seconds, to cover troops that scrambled to secure a landing zone and suppress ambushes that erupted from the tree line. More times than not, they were the last ones shooting while the aircraft departed, giving the pilots precious seconds in which to fly away still intact. And soon, barracks across Vietnam echoed with a chilling phrase, a saying that captured the truth of how short a door gunner's life could be. 5-minute myth, deadly truth. Inside the barracks, a grim saying passed from veteran to rookie. A door gunner's life expectancy is 5 minutes. It wasn't a statistic pulled from reports or official records. It was gallows humor, a phrase that spread like wildfire because it carried a chilling ring of truth. Everyone knew it wasn't literally 5 minutes, but the message was clear. When a firefight erupted, the door gunners were often the first to take hits, and, sometimes, the first to die. The joke masked fear, but it also revealed a reality that could not be ignored. The reason was simple. The door gunner's position put him directly in the line of fire. Unlike pilots seated behind bullet-resistant glass or infantry, who could at least dive for cover, the gunner had nowhere to hide. Kneeling or standing in the open doorway, he was fully exposed from the waist up. The harness kept him from falling, but it did nothing against bullets. Every time a Huey slowed or hovered over a landing zone, enemy fighters scanned the doors and pulled triggers. The gunner became the most visible and accessible target on the aircraft. The odds were not reduced simply due to exposure, but the very nature of the task itself necessitated it. Suppressive fire meant keeping the barrel hot, raking tree lines and fields, forcing the enemy to duck. That job required staying visible longer than anyone else. The gunner had to lean out, track movements below, and sometimes fire continuously, even as tracer rounds streaked past. It was a role built on sacrifice. To keep everyone else alive, the gunner had to absorb the risk. Every bullet he fired drew a dozen back in his direction. The fact illustrates how the burden has turned out to be indeed heavy. A very heavy bulk of the 4,900 helicopter crew members who were slain in Vietnam was either door gunners or crew chiefs. Exact numbers have been blurred over time, but the imbalance, however, was undeniable. The casualties were not just random, they were also structural. The Huey was designed to transport, not to fight. Its hollow metallic casing had no armored sides for its crew. Just adding firepower did not change that. The machine was very fragile, so the men at its doors became its armor. A story of bravery since, for often acted beyond reason if a person would like to survive. Gary Wetzel, specialist, was one of those who made the rounds. His Huey was hit on a December day, 1968, by a rocket-propelled grenade. In that explosion, nearly his left arm was blasted off, later amputated. But instead of falling down, he fashioned a makeshift tourniquet with splinters of his shirt, crawled back to the skid, and continued shooting with his M60 until every man on board had escaped. He survived and later received the Medal of Honor.
Authorized by Act of Congress, March 3, 1863, has awarded in the name of the Congress the Medal of Honor to Specialist 4 Gary G. Wetzel, United States Army.
But his story resonated because it captured what gunners lived with every day. You really don't have a choice. It is your job. Stay at your post while staring into very likely fire. But neither heroism nor skill could make up for the most glaring blunder. No amount of competence, bravery, or determination on the part of individual men could escape the inexorable physics of their situation. Hovering helicopters being transformed into sitting the first contact with enemy fire always made by the man at the door. It stuck because it rang true, even if crews laughed it off, because deep inside, they carried it with them every time they clipped into the harness. If the aircraft couldn't protect its gunners, maybe overwhelming firepower could. What happened next turned transports into Frankenstein gunships and unleashed new risks. Franken Hueys, Thin Skin. Once the truth sank in that no amount of speed or altitude could shield a hovering Huey, commanders scrambled for alternatives. The answer they reached for wasn't subtle or refined. If the helicopters couldn't be hidden, then maybe they could be turned into flying weapons platforms, spewing so much firepower that enemies couldn't lift their heads long enough to shoot back. This desperate logic gave birth to one of the strangest evolutions of the Vietnam War: the field-modified Huey gunship. The process began with improvisation. Crews swapped out the standard M60s for electrically driven M134 miniguns, capable of spitting 3,000 rounds per minute, 50 bullets every second. Nose mounts soon carried M5 grenade launchers, each able to lob 40mm explosives at tree lines and bunkers. And then came the rocket pods. Early versions like the XM3 could hold 24 folding fin rockets. Later designs, like the M200, carried 19 Hydra 70 rockets per pod, 2 on each side. That meant a single Huey could unload 38 rockets in seconds, turning an ordinary transport into something closer to a flying artillery piece. These heavily modified aircraft earned nicknames as colorful as their loadouts. Hogs and frogs became common terms, and unit photos from 1965 show Hueys carrying everything from extra door guns to French-made SS-11 anti-tank missiles welded onto improvised racks. The running joke was, if it fits on a pylon, we'll shoot it. The results were undeniably fierce. These flying monsters could light up a landing zone, soften up ambush sites, and rain down fire in ways no standard slick could match. For infantry waiting below, the sound of rockets and miniguns overhead meant survival. But with it came the price of transformation. Weapons added weight, and there was no great tolerance for such weight on the Huey's airframe. Fully armed gunships found it difficult to remain on hover for not more than 90 seconds before rotor over-temperature or lift loss situations arose. Those conditions were further exacerbated in the hot, humid air of Vietnam. An overloaded helicopter could barely hover for the time it took to drop off troops, much less give them cover for any sustained period. The crews knew well that every pound of ordnance strapped to the airframe reduced maneuverability, reaction time, and increased its susceptibility to endure whatever battle came its way. None of the fixes, however, could address Huey's basic design flaw: a wide body, a huge target. Vital components of this aircraft engine, transmission, and tail rotor remain unarmored. A single fortunate shot from a small arms weapon was capable of bringing down the best-armed gunship. Immediately targeting rotor hubs and fuel tanks, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces made adjustments in their aim. All modifications allowed gunners to operate with more weaponry and cover more angles. Theirs was still an exposed position. Still standing on the skids, leaning into the slipstream, they were now managing belts for miniguns and loading up rocket pods. More firepower may have been available, but it came with increased responsibility and danger. Lighting brush fires with gasoline, as pilots would later have that phrase come to describe the effect. Missions became louder, hotter, and heavier, but survivability didn't develop nearly as fast as firepower did. One sortie became a trade-off: incredible fire on the enemy in exchange for greater vulnerability to hits. The answer wasn't more guns on a truck. It was a new machine, born to fight, slim to be missed, and fast enough to live. Cobra, built to survive. By the mid-1960s, it was clear that bolting more guns onto Hueys was not a lasting solution. Field improvisations produced flying monsters that could spit rockets and grenades, but the aircraft itself remained too slow, too wide, and too fragile. Engineers at Bell Helicopter recognized what crews already knew. The Army didn't need a transport that could fight. It needed a helicopter designed to fight first and carry nothing else. That realization marked the birth of the world's first dedicated attack helicopter, the AH-1 Cobra.
The Bell AH-1 Cobra was the first helicopter built solely for combat, its sleek silhouette gliding over the jungles of Vietnam.
The Cobra's design philosophy was radically different. Instead of a broad fuselage meant to haul troops, Bell stripped the frame down to its essentials. They kept what worked from the Huey, the reliable Lycoming T-53 turbine engine, the sturdy transmission, and the proven rotor system. Everything else was reimagined. The result was a long, narrow fuselage, barely wide enough for 2 crew members seated in tandem. The gunner sat up front, the pilot behind and slightly elevated, giving both men clear lines of sight. This slim profile reduced drag, boosted speed, and presented a far smaller target to enemy gunners. The weapons suite of the Cobra turned theory into practice. Engineers sculpted a turret mounted under its nose for either a 7.62mm M134 minigun, a 40mm grenade launcher, or both. Such a combination would allow the Cobra to sweep trenches, tear apart bunkers, or lob grenades without even turning the airframe. On each stub wing, it could carry rocket pods, usually 2 per side with 19 Hydra 70 rockets on each. In seconds, a single Cobra could unleash 38 rockets, leveling treetops or silencing machine gun nests before infantry even touched down. Unlike the Huey, these systems weren't improvised. They were built into the design from day one. Survival with flight and dexterity. A fully loaded Cobra would rip across 170 miles per hour, especially when compared to a Huey weighing down with rockets. It has an almost diminutive cross-section in radar and visual terms because of its narrow body. Crews learned quickly to use this stealth advantage of skimming treetops, popping up for a quick rocket strike, and disappearing almost immediately, even before the gunners could adjust their aim. It was definitely light ballistic, and steel plates were available only to guard the fuel tanks, gearboxes, and other critical systems. The cockpit glass would protect against small arms fire, lending safety to a crew that had never been known in Hueys. Equally important, both crew members had full flight controls. If the pilot was hit, the gunner could take over and fly them out. First used in Vietnam in 1967, the Cobra was soon proving its worth. Assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division, these new attack helicopters immediately began escorting Huey slicks. Instead of transports trying to protect themselves with bungee-mounted M60s, the gunships went in ahead, clearing landing zones with rockets and suppressing extractions with devastating wallops. By late 1967, unit records show a measurable reduction in helicopter losses when Cobras took on escort duties. Crews had finally found an aircraft that could take some punishment and dish it right back. The Cobra changed tactics. The Army began experimenting with hunter-slayer teams that coupled him fast, lightly armed OH-6 Loach scouts with Cobra gunships, allowing them to conduct attacks. In this tactic, the Loach flew low to draw enemy fire while the Cobra circled overhead, waiting to pounce. When the Loach marked a target, the Cobra unleashed a hail of rockets or grenades. This method worked marvelously well, but took a toll on Loaches suffering horrific losses. For the first time, helicopters dictated the terms of engagement instead of passively reacting. The courageous stories bore out the promise of the Cobra. In 1968, Lieutenant Larry Taylor flew into impossible odds in saving a besieged reconnaissance patrol. Out of munitions and nearly out of fuel, he had the soldiers hold on to the skids and rocket pods as he extricated them under enemy fire. All 4 survived. Taylor's audacity underscored what set the Cobra apart. It wasn't merely an aircraft with increased firepower, it was a purpose-built platform for survival. Yet even snakes bled. Vietnam had a final trial where every flaw in the helicopter wore, exposure, density of fire, tempo, crashed together. Lam Son 719. Blood Lesson. By early 1971, the United States was trying to shift more of the fighting burden onto South Vietnam. Washington needed proof that its ally could operate independently, so when planners drew up Operation Lam Son 719, they saw it as the perfect test.
More than 1,000 U.S. planes conducted bombing missions, as well as combat missions for hundreds of U.S. helicopters in that war. Operation Lam Son 719 is little remembered and poorly understood.
The goal was bold: drive westward into Laos, slice into the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and strangle the supply routes that fed North Vietnamese forces in the south. On paper, the plan looked decisive. In practice, it became a brutal trial by fire for helicopter crews. Because American ground troops were barred from crossing the border, helicopters had to shoulder the entire weight of the operation. Every insertion, every resupply, every medevac, thousands of sorties in contested skies. More than 600 aircraft massed near Khe Sanh, including Huey Slicks, Chinooks, and the newer Cobra gunships. It was the largest helicopter deployment of the war, and pilots joked that when the first wave lifted off on February 8th, the sky looked like it had been filled with angry bees. The humor masked a creeping dread. Everyone knew the North Vietnamese would not let this go unchallenged. They were right. For the better part of 7 months, enemy troops dragged anti-aircraft weapons across the jungle. They're laying them out at various likely places where aircraft might pass. Everything from heavy machine guns to radar-guided 37mm cannons lay in ambush. The North Vietnamese waited until the helicopters committed themselves dangerously near, then unleashed walls of tracer rounds. In those first days, lots of helicopters were falling in clusters. On February 10th, a Huey flying 4 of the war's most respected photographers, Larry Burroughs, Kent Potter, Henry Hewitt, and Keisaburo Shimamoto, was shot over Laos. They all died on the spot, a reminder that even observers were not that safe at times. The intensity only grew. On February 13, 1971, crews endured what was subsequently known as Black Monday. Dozens of helicopters tried to resupply and evacuate troops at Ranger North, a besieged outpost deep inside Laos. Enemy fire raked the skies, and by noon, more than 40 helicopters had been hit or destroyed. The pilots described utter chaos: wheels of fire against the hillside, clouds of smoke rising from craters, and troops and soldiers waving frantically for evacuation through a hail of gunfire streaking the landing zone. But in came the crews. For the Rangers on the ground, that helicopter was the only lifeline. In the case of this slaughter, there were a few things that showed courage. On February 18th, a medevac Huey from the 237th Medical Detachment was shot apart and forced to go down inside Ranger North. Specialist 5 Dennis Fuji, only 21, remained after several attempts at rescuing him failed. For 2 nights, he crawled through the wreckage, treating wounded soldiers while calling in American airstrikes so close they nearly hit his own position. He survived 4 days under fire before getting out. Decades later, in 2022, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. Fuji's story, therefore, epitomized the dogged valor that characterized Lam Son 719, when by all standards it appeared impossible to survive. The statistics were staggering. By the first week of March, Army Aviation was reporting 108 helicopters lost and more than 600 damaged. Within 60 days, 1 in 10 of all American helicopter crew deaths in Vietnam occurred during this one operation. It was the most bloody period during the entire helicopter warfare. Crews logged 16,000 hours of combat time and carried out 164,000 supply sling missions. But deploying these helicopters came at a ruinous price. For the survivors, Lam Son was remembered less for the strategy than as the name of a place where their friends fell from the sky. Which brings us to the core truth: the dark reason door gunners died at such rates. It wasn't just bravery against bullets. It was the system they flew inside. The dark reason laid bare. By the time the last American helicopters lifted out of Vietnam, the legend of the door gunner was sealed in blood. Thousands had volunteered, thousands had served, and far too many never came back. Historians, veterans, and engineers all agree on one haunting point. The staggering death rate among door gunners was not simply the result of bravery meeting bad luck. It was built into the very system of helicopter warfare in Vietnam. The design, the doctrine, and the mission itself made their survival almost impossible. The first and most obvious factor was the mission profile. Unlike jets that struck targets at high altitude or infantry that could dig in for cover, helicopters had to descend, hover, and often wait in open landing zones. Every insertion and extraction created a predictable window of vulnerability. And during those minutes of hovering, the first line of defense was always the men in the doors. They weren't optional, they were essential. Suppressive fire had to come from somewhere, and it came from a human being leaning into the slipstream, firing at shadows in the tree line. Their exposure wasn't incidental, it was the mission itself. And indeed, the second factor was the design lag. The Huey was never made to fight. It was to be just a utility transport, not an armored attack helicopter. Such losses could only mount before the Army could wait years for a new, purpose-built gunship. The stopgap solution was to strap weapons onto airframes that couldn't handle the added weight or risks. Door gunners became a patch for structural flaws, human armor covering design weaknesses. By the time the Cobra was brought into service in 1967, thousands had already paid the price since years of improvisation had been spent by gunners. The third factor was the doctrine itself. The American commanders viewed air mobility as a revolutionary means of projecting their power quickly into remote jungles, and in many ways, they were right. The helicopter altered the pace of warfare, but it was that very speed that came at a price: exposure. Each time air cavalry tactics inserted units deep into enemy territory, door gunners paid the risk. The doctrine demanded bravery to fill the gap where protection was absent. It morally sanctioned a cycle in which volunteers from supply depots or motor pools would occupy the most dangerous seat on the battlefield, not because it was safe, but because the mission required it. The real grim reason why door gunners did not survive at such high rates is not due to lack of training, discipline, or grit. On the contrary, they possessed all three in abundance. The real reason behind that was the paradoxical nature of helicopter warfare in Vietnam, for with air mobility, it actually meant placing exposed men at the point of greatest danger. Until heavy numbers rolled up purpose-built attack helicopters, the system itself guaranteed a straight and continuous infusion of casualties. Door gunners were just unlucky. They were expendable by design. Veterans often seem to ponder how strange it is. The presence of Cobras basically provided support, increasing survivability rates and ending the necessity for a door gunner. The Apache and its successors are showing what could have been possible earlier: the provision of an armored cockpit, advanced sensors, and heavy weapons, actionably weighing in the doorway. The technology solved the problem eventually, but only after the irreversible decay of young men for mere technology. If this pulled back the curtain on what door gunners really faced, tap like, drop a comment with the stories or questions you want us to cover next, and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden choices that shape combat. And if you want to see how the Cobra's lessons built a machine that changed warfare across decades, watch the next video on your screen now.